Welcome back to the Op Show, where we bring you the trials and tribulations, the automations and collaborations from the world of DevOps and the greater developer experience. I'm your host, Tristan Pollock, and as always, with CTO.ai founder Kyle Campbell. In our best show yet, we have Neej Gore, an amateur pizza chef and president of the cloud division of Zeta Global, one of the largest big data companies in the world. Very excited to hear about that. Welcome, Neej. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Tristan.
Tell us a little bit about your story and how you got to where you are today. I know it's involved a lot of startups and ups and downs, and it's been quite the journey. We met along the way in San Francisco as well.
Thanks, Tristan. I will. And before we get started, I just want to comment that my mug, which is a Lion King mug, nicely matches your shirt. So props on the fashion choice for the day. But yeah, I can give you a little bit of my story.
We didn't even plan that.
I know, we didn't even plan that. So yeah, so I have been a technology and other entrepreneur since graduating from college. I had my first startup when I was graduating from college, and I sold it to a company in Boston. To date myself a little bit, that first company was building intranets that layered upon college ERP systems. This was before you could do things like registering for classes online or checking your grades online. So that was back in 1999, 2000. And then that sort of ignited my passion for startups and building things. And since then, I've had the pleasure of being part of several types of startups, ranging from owning a couple of bars in San Francisco that I built from ground up, to a coffee company and roastery here in Oakland and now around the world, to about 3 other technology companies that were usually in data, machine learning, and marketing technology. So the most recent one was a company called Boomtrain that was really an AI platform for marketers that was acquired by Zeta Global just over 3 years ago, and has now become one of the core stacks that lives within Zeta Global. And Zeta, for those of you who don't know, is a marketing technology company that specializes in really driving acquisition, growth, and retention outcomes for enterprise marketers. And we have, as Tristan mentioned, one of the largest consumer data assets in North America. And you may have heard of some of the brands that we own, like Disqus, which is the largest commenting platform in the world, and others. But that's my current role there, really, is to be the steward of the data cloud division, which is really underpins and powers most of our data-driven technology solutions for the largest enterprises around.
It's impressive. So a little bit about Zeta. Is Zeta sort of a portfolio of brands? You found your way there by acquisition, and obviously there's other brands that we would know about.
It very much used to be kind of like a portfolio of companies that were acquired almost in a private equity style model. When they acquired Boomtrain, the company itself started to migrate to more of a product first company. So now if you look at Zeta, it looks very different than it looked 3 or 4 years ago. Now it's very, very product led. It's a marketing technology company. We have certain assets that contribute to the data asset that we cultivate and maintain, and then we leverage that data in different ways. But this year, for example, Forrester rated us as the top platform for marketing tech amongst a very crowded ecosystem of companies that included Oracle and Salesforce. So it's probably the largest marketing technology company that very few consumers have ever heard of, because we just don't spend a lot of money on marketing ourselves, but that's starting to change too.
Yeah, and maybe this is something you can pull up on the screen, Tristan, but I noticed, I think it was yesterday in the ops community, you shared, obviously a very thin slice of some of those insights that you're able to drive, but it put a little bit of context for me in how you're able to use different kinds of data to drive what seemed like very macro level insights around this crazy world we're in.
The world has been absolutely nuts, and it's really the combination of several things coming together at the same time. It's a combination of condition that's kind of like the Dust Bowl with the race riots, with the pandemic, all sort of converging at the same time. So, this gives you a view of some different indices that we track on a macro level, things like, how are people dining in and out? How are people visiting stores? Are people still moving their houses? Are they still buying homes? You can think of what these things end up powering our underlying use cases for marketers. For example, I recently did a webinar with Burger King and Panera, and it was really interesting to see and hear about how their data-driven strategies evolved entering COVID and how the two different brands had bounced back. Burger King was really enabled from a technical perspective and a digital perspective, and Panera wasn't. A lot of their business was based on lunch catering, in offices. So they really had to make quick pivots. So people leverage the type of insights that we provide to figure out, where the market is heading as a leading indicator. But behind every one of those bars in the bar chart and behind every economic graph that we put up or any market-driven graph, there are actual people behind that. It's all people-based marketing. So everything in our world revolves back to and resolves back to an individual, and that individual can be acted on in different ways. You could learn how to reach them programmatically. You could learn how to reach them from a email perspective or a connected TV perspective. Now that connected TV is becoming much more of a prevalent channel. But the general theme of the last 6 months, huge compression to digital. So there was even a point, a few months ago when people were afraid to check their mail. Not everywhere, but in a lot of the US. And so, even direct mail, which is a huge channel for so many marketers and enterprises, started to lose its value. So that even in that kind of established channel, a lot of the business started to shift to digital and digital touches. And so we help to power all of those omni-channel type experiences that get delivered.
This is very interesting. I founded a company in 2013 called Retzley. It was mostly focused on, normalizing and democratizing access to accessible real estate data in the form of MLS public records. And especially as we went down learning about public records, I knew very little about any of this when I started. It's always how startups go, right? But we heard a lot from different segments of industry. And it sounds like this is sort of what you're tapping into, is how valuable these derivative insights can be. I mean, someone who's well known in the real estate industry for how they do this would be somebody like maybe Host Canary or even like Black Knight, which is very financially or real estate driven. But there's a huge market for this derivative understanding of what the volume of real estate transaction actually means in the macro market. And it sounds like that's generally how you're deriving these base level or maybe even industry specific data sets into this broader theme.
Yep. So an example would be that when you visit a Disqus page and you're interacting with content, even if you're just reading the content, we can apply NLP to that page to figure out what are the topics that you're gravitating towards. Was the sentiment of the article positive or negative? What's the recency and frequency of your visits to that type of content? And then that helps us understand the consumer in a whole new way, right? So it's beyond just, are you male, female, your income bracket and so forth. It's a really kind of real-time view. We call it data in motion, of how a user's preferences and behaviors are changing over time. And when you combine that data in motion view with a more of a data at rest view, which is a very traditional way of doing marketing or even segmentation, you get a very different kind of understanding of a consumer or even potentially a voter. The elections are coming up and people are more charged up now than ever before. And they're gravitating towards content online that really either helps to fortify their viewpoint or potentially helps to educate them about something they're looking to learn about. Those are the same types of signals. I mean, the political marketers are some of the most data-driven marketers that are out there. And one thing I'll say from a DevOps perspective is that, at the core of this entire system, you can imagine we're processing something like 100 billion page view signals a month on top of 200 million Americans. And on top of that, we attach things like location data, we attach transaction data from our partners. And so, the amount of data that flows through our queues is just tremendous to maintain and persist. And being able to process that on a daily basis and essentially rebuild the models on a daily basis takes tremendous computing power. So there's a huge ops challenge involved in maintaining an asset like this. And the Kafka queues and so forth that we put in place have to be um, basically very, very efficient to do this at scale and in a cost efficient way. So all of that is, and that really, what we call it in our vernacular, we call that feeding the identity graph. So an identity graph is a graph that essentially can map your digital identifiers with your persistent offline identifiers into one place. And that's always being updated based on the type of activity that you're taking online.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that, and maybe it'd be cool if you could drill a little bit deeper without going into anything too proprietary. But obviously, within, you mentioned Kafka and within the open model, one of the things that I very much realized from my experience is that these kinds of insights are only really achievable at a massive kind of scale. So what are some of those technologies that your team puts in place within the cloud data and data cloud division that makes some of that possible? Where have
Yep.
you found really good success with open source technology like Kafka to help you
Yeah, so
get to that kind of
Kafka's been
scale?
great. Kafka's been great. We've made some shifts in our stack from Redshift to Snowflake. Snowflake is going to probably have one of the largest IPOs of the year.
Right.
If you guys know,
There's
they're
some
about to
really
go.
interesting discussion on Twitter about that recently, about the time in the market at which Snowflake came to be in 2012. Every other data company had just gotten bought, and that was sort of like their AWS moment where they almost were unchallenged. Yeah. So it's interesting to hear as a user of Snowflake.
They had a runaway. They had a runaway story. I think that some of the other big players like Microsoft and Amazon are probably looking at that moment and asking themselves why they didn't swoop in or try to take advantage of the market that was available to them. But it was sort of probably a combination of an oversight and an undersight all happening at the same time that led to that. But so Snowflake. But for us, I think that one of the biggest considerations for us, and I hear about this as we're a large company, we're a unicorn. The last 6 months have been very, very trying on most consumer businesses. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about cost and certainly our technology infrastructure is one of our largest drivers of cost. And so we're always looking at how we can reduce that. We've moved some of our technologies to data center environments off of AWS.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. Well, when we acquired Seismic, which was a DSP platform, one of the largest DSPs, they were running in a data center environment, and you can think that the requirements of a DSP, you need to have incredible speed because these are the systems that are essentially bidding on auctions that are happening online. So the requirements that you have with that kind of environment are different than an environment where you'd allow for a 1 day lag or a latency in your your model builds and things like that. So they had environments that were well set up for this, and we were able to consolidate down. And so some of our moves have been to move from AWS to the DSP data centers that were being consolidated, and that saved us some money. And then there's just general best practices that we're also trying to instill in our analysts, because what we find typically is that an analyst will usually want to run a query or actually perform an operation as fast as possible, right? There's a business need, business requirement. They're trying to generate a report. If it's not running through a platform service, which is built for cost efficiency, typically they're running off of Athena. But Athena, when you are getting into the sort of the higher processing requirements, becomes very expensive. And so moving some of those into Hive and other strategies have been used within the team to try to offset costs. But it's a constant struggle for us, and it's not really, I shouldn't say struggle is the right word. It's a constant optimization for us, and because we especially in an environment where most companies in the last 6 months did some kind of sizing and cost reduction exercise, right? So if you can resize your tech and make it more efficient, and by doing so you can save headcount and save people's jobs, that is a much better way to go about reaching your EBITDA goals. So we've certainly taken that approach, and we value our people more than anything else. So so it's been an exercise, and we have a great we have a small but very productive DevOps team that runs most of those functions on our side as well.
Yeah, that's really really interesting. I mean, to be at the kind of scale, and I've heard of this a few times in recent years, where the movement off of the sort of, I guess we call it the public cloud, back to your own data centers makes sense. That's a really interesting engineering thing, and it's almost a full circle opportunity if you think about cloud computing in general. And it just reinforces to your point that a lot of technology is a journey, right? And it's kind of right thing for the right time, and you get to this place where unit economics allow you to drive down these cost centers and drive more value to not only your people but your customers, likely through owning your own infrastructure. And
Totally.
that must come with quite a large overhead for your DevOps team as they think about the tools and the best practices and all of the different supporting things around this.
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. I think that one of the things that's a little bit different about Zeta is that Zeta has been in the business of email for many years, like 11 years. And so we've run and we continue to run some of the largest MTAs in the world. We send email for most of the top enterprises in some capacity or another. So we had good experience from the DevOps side in this type of environment. We were comfortable working with this environment. And there's some nuances about our company that are really unique. So that's one of them. The other one is that our operating model has offices around the globe. So we have folks in India, we have folks in Prague, we have folks in New York, we have San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and an assortment of other cities like Hyderabad in India and Bangalore are two of our centers of excellence. So through that as well, we've had to think about how we want to distribute our technology, our resourcing, and where everything should live to make the company as cost efficient as possible. But we're, as I mentioned, we're about a 11-year-old company, 12-year-old company. So we had a lot of experience in data center technology, and we had our office of our CIO was a well-developed office even prior to the acquisition of Boomtrain. And frankly, I've learned a lot more about that side of the house since joining. I think a lot of startups, including Boomtrain, were spending huge amounts of money on a monthly basis with AWS. And one of the first and easiest exercises that happens post-acquisition is, how do we save money and where? And some of the experience that Zeta brought to the table really helped us along those lines.
That's awesome.
Well, some of the news that was coming out of KubeCon Europe recently was talking about just how, not just how complicated data centers can be to run, but just how much power consumption. And like you said, it can be this huge cost suck. Like, how do you think about that, as you're moving, into this kind of, I don't know, let's say like this climate change age? Have you been involved with any of those conversations about like the pure energy consumption that comes from data centers, especially since I'm guessing you're storing quite a huge amount of data that's coming in from all these different streams?
Yeah, so we're still very much enabled on the cloud for things that need to happen more real time, or things that are changing in a manner that we can support. So that's a good question, Tristan. I'm actually not probably the best person to answer the energy requirement, but I think that as time goes on, those implications will become more and more relevant. You can sort of see that all the Bitcoin miners, initially basically were mining everywhere they could, and when they realized that certain energy regions were better than others, you saw like server farms go up. We've also seen there's a lot of Bitcoin hacking into people's environments and running off of their AWS now happening. So I think that Bitcoin sort of analogy is probably going to be one that is more broadly felt, but not yet for us, but probably becomes a reality in a few years as well.
Yeah, well, you're well positioned to have strong control over your unit economics there with the move to your own data centers anyway, right? And I think that's probably one of the most interesting things about going to that lower layer of feasibility within your architecture model is it just opens the door where, you know, as that conversation drives into your business, you're able to make motions where, you know, a lot of people who are just, you know, dependent on the abstract public cloud, you know, you're really at the cost of inflation, and you're just hoping that, you know, consumerization drives the utility down over time for AWS
Sure.
as it's democratized. I mean, Moore's law, basically, right?
Yep. Moore's law, exactly.
Another big thing is, you know, I think we're kind of always talking about it now when it comes to the data realm, as you know, this idea of privacy and, you know, what people are willing to share, and also like what's the culture in a certain area, you know, and you know, we've seen EU kind of get ahead, start making more legislation, you know, and then even like the US is, you know, vastly different than like the perceptions in someone in China and the willingness to share their own personal data. Like, how do you think about that side of it?
Sure. It's a great question, actually, and that's been on you know, all of our minds, my mind specifically, for a long time. And I think that, you know, generally, and Zeta is more of a marketing technology company, but if you look at the broader ecosystem that includes MarTech and AdTech just generally had a pretty bad reputation between you know, the vendors and the consumers. And the reason is because there's a lot of mistrust. And mistrust has existed at many different levels in the ad tech ecosystem. First of all, you know, who's tracking you and how are they tracking you and where are they tracking you? Are people listening to your phones? You know, consumers have all these questions on their mind, right? So, and there's not a lot of clarity in terms of what actually is happening.
What, yeah.
Because,
The Instagram ad, or like all of a sudden I
yeah.
got this Instagram ad and I was like speaking to my friend about it.
Yeah, you're like talking. I know last week I was with somebody and they were talking about John Deere tractors, which is a really odd thing for them to be talking about. And the next day they saw an ad for John Deere like popping up again and again on their Instagram.
Was that through
feed.
chat or was that through voice? Because chat, I know, is
Voice.
here. Voice, I
Yeah.
was more skeptical.
Yeah, it was voice actually,
Wow.
which was the weird thing, right? And you know, we have a few people in our company that are convinced that voice is already a channel. We give access to your microphone to different apps. I'm skeptical about that too, actually, but some of the coincidences are just hard to ignore. But so you know, Google now has decided that there's, you know, the third-party cookie will no longer exist as it has in previous years, right? So what does this do? So for the first thing it does is it entirely disrupts the advertising ecosystem, which by and large right now runs off of a third-party cookie.
And I would argue that might be intentional on Google's part.
100%.
Yeah.
Because basically, so there's two things that are happening here. So by eliminating the third-party cookie, you're inherently creating an environment where trust is going to be required. So, you know, basically the consumer is able to then share their information with the first party that they've actually consented to share their information with. So anyone that's downstream from that now falls off. And a lot of the cookie syncs that happen right now and a lot of the actual data tracking and you know, sort of audience building that takes place in the market is all being driven by the third-party environments. So I get it. And I think that, and I also believe that the future of advertising is going to have to 100% rely on trust, because with trust, you can build relevancy for consumers, and the companies that are delivering great experiences will also win. But the benefit for Google in this scenario as well is that Google is probably the largest walled garden in the world.
Yeah. Facebook
you know,
maybe close, right? It's kind of similar.
Facebook maybe close,
Yeah.
but you know, at Zeta, we like to think that we are an incredibly large walled garden as well because of our Disqus presence. But Google, if you think about how many apps they serve to you, from Gmail to you know, your Google Analytics suite, you know, authentication is part of their ecosystem. It's part of their ethos. So they have their first-party relationships with basically everybody, and you know, so they're able to sort of advance their cause at the same time as building trust in the ecosystem. So now, you know, what's happened is that most marketers don't want to rely on just these two walled gardens or these three walled gardens to exist. So there's consortiums that have started and co-ops that have started that are going to also come up through this. And a good example would be the Trade Desk which is the largest, DSP in the world. And they're going to have their own ID space as well. And, now publishers that are actually monetizing through Google and their admin inventory, authentication is going to become much more important. So, that login or the single sign-on type of event will be sort of more prevalent in the internet. We're already seeing a shift to that. I don't think the GDPR as it exists in Europe will take hold in the US. I think the commercial interests here are different. And frankly, I think the laws here are just different. But we will see a complete refactoring of the ad tech ecosystem, in 12 to 18 months. And, brands and businesses that are interested in building trust with their consumers will win. And the ones that don't take actions towards that path will fall out along the way.
I'm curious, like, as I hear you talk about this, my mind is racing to analogies, and you talk about EU and the commercial interest, but I also think it's like there's just so many countries with different interests, and there's almost a distributed sort of trust thing there where EU is kind of trying to handle for a diverse set of interests as they would, as a consortium. But then you have the US, which is a more sort of centralized or federated set of interests commercially, like you said. That
Sure.
seems in some ways analogous to your strategy with Zeta, where there's a number of different products, and there's sort of this distributed trust model where I can build trust with Disqus, maybe build trust with Boomtrain, versus how Google or Facebook are taking sort of that all-in-one federated brand. How do you think about that from both a trust but also a strategic advantage standpoint? Because I can see lots of different ways in which diversifying that trust into segments can be really powerful for how you guys are thinking about this paradigm.
It can allow you to hedge, if you have a distributed trust model. I think that the main thing for Zeta, which makes us, I think, friendlier on the enterprise side, is that as opposed to Facebook and even Google, we have much more portability and transportability. So with our advertisers we're working with, the enterprises we work with, we're way more open to sharing our learnings, right? Like when you run a Facebook campaign, here's my audience criteria and here's your result. And whatever happened in the middle is sort of like just black box, which is great. I mean, they've created an amazing model around this. That's not really our model. And even our consumer model, Disqus is is a very well-known sort of brand where people have the opportunity to be vocal. It drives publisher engagement. So if you think about what the purpose of Disqus is, it's a tool that helps publishers really give voice to their communities, right? And get their communities engaged with their products. So from that perspective, it's a very powerful tool to drive engagement on sites. And it's all the way down to the consumer level. We're trying to empower the voice of the consumer through the process. And Zeta's approach is really to take advantage of tools like that and add tools like that to our ecosystem. And those tools will survive. They'll be the backbone of this new trust-based model that exists in a post-cookie, third-party cookie world. And so we look at businesses like that in a really interesting way. And once you have that, if you can build more relevance for the consumer, and you can allow the advertiser to basically do more with less, you've created a winning scenario on both sides. And so that's sort of the sweet spot at where we want to operate.
Yeah, it's very smart. Have you looked at Brave browsers? So they had the basic attention token for a while. I mean, that's sort of an interesting new area of innovation within this model. What do you see there, and how do you think the world progresses?
So it's interesting. Yeah. So the attention token, so it's essentially the attention token is a way for publishers to monetize, and outside of ad revenue or traditional ad revenue. I think it's going to be hard for long tail publishers to really monetize that way. And the reason why is because I think the payments are happening at such a small scale. If you look at Disqus's publisher volume, there are probably 5 million publishers. Many of them are long tail, right? So they're small publishers. They don't have logins on their sites. So I don't know if Brave is going to be a solution for those kinds of guys. At the top end of this, of course, there's a lot of ways you can go to keep those publishers in business and keep them providing good content. But But Brave has certainly done something interesting, right? The BAT, the token is an interesting way to reward providing relevance and reward providing service that consumers are attracted to. I don't really see it taking off in a really wide way because of the nature of the publishing environment, but I think there's some takeaways from that will certainly exist in the future state.
Yeah, it seems like a strong advancement on, a prospect for the trust model, that's very consumer
Yeah.
friendly, but maybe doesn't have, like, to your point, the unit economics to play out at scale for the
I think
commercial
they've nailed the
interests that
consumer
drive
side.
it. Yeah.
I think they've nailed, the consumer side is very strong, but to make this ecosystem work, you need to actually have a reward system for the publisher that's going to work too.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's like a marketplace, right? Yeah. To some degree, that both sides need to see the value to continue. Uh, and so, to some degree, Google has a conflict of interest because they want to do these changes and create these changes in the ecosystem, but they also run a very significant ad business. So, and if the changes that they're implementing are primarily, or they're one of the biggest benefactors of those changes, that creates a little bit of a conflict of interest, even though I think intentionally the notion that they're trying to build more trust in the ecosystem is 100% the right thing to do. I think that's the way that ad tech sort of recovers from some of the negative reputation it's seen over the last 10 years. And that's the way that inevitably that consumers will win by getting a better experience. And I think marketers and brands will win too, because they'll be able to do, again, do more with less, essentially. So.
Yeah. So maybe even going back a second, like what, was it, the industry, was it the consumer privacy push? Like what sort of trends pushed Google to do this in the first place?
Good question. I think that there is essentially in the industry some headwinds some tailwinds that have been moving this way for a long time, right? So you look at retargeting and the notion of retargeting. So you go to a page and then you see that ad like 8 more times, and then they expire you from their targeting. I think that the way that browsers were passing data between different companies was just something that needed to be regulated, and people have taken different approaches. Like GDPR is a very strict standard, right? So virtually overnight, just troughs of European data were purged from systems worldwide. And they've created a system where you have to provide explicit consent. So it's an opt-in system to actually provide your data to a partner. The US, by and large, operates more like an opt-out system. So you have to opt out if you don't want to provide your data, or that's the way things are at least heading. But that being said, I think that third-party tracking was just something that was happening and was being perceived as nefarious activity at some level. And the idea that it was doing something nefarious behind the scenes, that idea continued to gain momentum. And certainly there are, bad apples that were doing bad things with the data. So,
Can you think
you
of an
probably heard
example,
about.
obviously, without calling anyone out? Yeah, sorry. I mean, I'd really
Yeah,
interested to
so
understand.
I think that let's take location data, for example,
Yeah.
right? So your phone and your location of where you're moving, and on a regular basis. So, there are a lot of location data providers out there, right? You can buy the maid IDs against places of interest that they've visited, but not all of them are collecting those location and data points in consent proper ways. So as the end consumer, I mean, you are basically being tracked in a way that I think the general consumer wouldn't understand, right? They don't know that when they just move around the world with their phone in their pocket, someone knows where they're going and what they're doing. Now, there are, and you can make the case that when you opt into an app and they show you their terms and conditions and you just click accept, well, you probably still don't know everything they're doing with your data, but there's been at least one checkpoint along the way. So these are the types of use cases where I think they're trying to really put the kibosh on the spread of data beyond where the relationship exists. And so, that one location partner may have been taking that data and reselling it to 8 other partners who arbitraged it and sold it to 5 other partners. So all of a sudden, that one data point that it was originally established, maybe through consent or maybe not, has now been shared downstream with, however many players. And that's where things get a little bit tricky. The user is not really getting value out of all of those sales and resale of their data. And so, that's not really a fair model in which the world can operate. So that's just one example, but there's a lot of examples like this.
One way that I've thought about this, and I guess this is more from the time I spent on public records data, especially in the real estate industry, is there is a lot of this data that's just public record. It's county and it gets aggregated up. You could say it's at very least municipally available, if not federally consolidated in most circles. And it's just public records. It's like right of information, and this is sort of like some of that founding American ideals of the Freedom of Information Act, et cetera, right? Yep. So when I look at that, I've always just set that as my baseline and thought, okay, well, I'm not Canadian, but I'm not American, I'm Canadian, so we have different privacy laws. But if I was American, I'd say, okay, well, there's this baseline of freedom of information. And so I'm open to the idea that when I'm in the public domain, and maybe this is a bit libertarian, there's certain rights that I give up, and that's reinforced by some of this freedom of information. And as I thought about that as it goes to technology, I've always thought, okay, well, I mean, there's at very least this data is in some regards, indistinguishable to me. If not, I'm hiding in numbers as I would be in any kind of mass public environment. But so I feared it a little bit less, I think, as a consumer. But I'd be really interested in to hear your take on how this data and this data at scale and that anonymity, or even some of that concept, as the converges into the world of AI and this supercomputing that we actually have, what the world starts to look like, and should I still potentially have this sort of less worried viewpoint of it, because we've all seen Skynet and we know how, or some of these futuristic movies, and we all know how those turn out. Where do you think the intersection of AI and this come in?
Yeah, so AI is sort of rooted in my background, or as we used to call it, machine learning.
Yes.
Now it's more fancy known as AI. But that's a great question. So I think getting back to your original question, or your original point, so data is available in the public sphere, but you always have to look at what are the acceptable uses of the data, because even if you can get census data and you can pull it down into an environment where you can run analytics against it, you're not always permitted to do things with the data, right? So that one caveat is that although your data is out there, it's not necessarily available for all use, and that's a checkpoint that has really never been well patrolled.
And this is mostly licensing constraints. Is this how you look at it?
I think so, and even if so you might be able to get data for measurement and for analytics, but not for targeting. This is a very common thing that you see in the data ecosystem when you license data. So there'll be acceptable use cases and use cases that are not accepted. But just generally speaking, I agree with you. I think that by being online, I think generally when you're surfing the internet, somebody's providing a service to you. And for that service, whether it's entertainment or it's information, you are providing them with something. And it's, as a utopian as I'd love the world to be, it's not a free place. So everyone needs to be paid for their contribution. Right now, maybe people aren't being paid as fairly as they could. Maybe they are. That's a debate for another day. But I definitely think that what you're getting at is this notion of when the convergence of signals that you collect intersects with the way that machine learning or AI is going, you start to build things that are incredibly predictive in a way that they never could be before, right? So
and you lose
I'll give you an
control
example
over that use. I would think. I mean, I hope that we have control over AI, the mythical AI when it shows up.
Think
but I mean,
I would say we still have control right now over the AI, but when things become non-intuitive to humans is when things start getting a little tricky.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. So we work with some of the gig companies, and last year we found that people that wear sleepwear or purchase sleepwear, right, with higher frequency, indexed high for one of the audiences that the gig companies was trying to acquire. And and so I was like, well, that makes absolutely no sense to me. And we looked at the data again, and we looked at the data a third time. We're like, well, it's right there. There's the signal. So what you start to find is these like non-intuitive signals. If you just feed these systems large unstructured sets of data, these non-intuitive signals start to emerge as being parts of the model, right? Features of the model. And when the machines can start doing that and then start creating their own ideas around how to basically run compute and build the best outcomes, then you start to get into sort of a scarier world. So I think that the hype of, at least in marketing technology, there's a lot of great machine learning happening. We are not yet close to machines fully taking over marketing functions. And I don't think we're going to be there for a long time. I think the function of AI, at least in the context of marketing technology, is very much to assist the marketer and to make their job easier and to make consumer experiences better. And usually what that means is you're individualizing the experience. You're adding personalization. You're not replacing the job of the marketer. You're more basically adding fidelity to the way that they market. But then, I've read in other ways, I think that there was recently, I forget the name of the company, but a company that basically has a technology that basically allows the AI to write articles, and it writes its own content, and it's writing articles that are virtually indiscernible from human written content,
Yeah.
right? So from that perspective, it's a pretty amazing feat, right? So especially if the articles have depth to them and they have interest, and you can really you can get someone to really read that and be taken by it. So we're definitely headed down this path, and it's going to be a pretty amazing. This is it, yeah. And it's going to be a pretty amazing world when these kinds of things exist. And I think for as many people that are scared that it will take away jobs and take away the human kind of innovation mindset, I think it's going to create even more, and I think it's going to create even more opportunities to innovate based on these new frameworks that exist and that come out, because there'll be so many more and use cases you can think of when these types of technologies become sort of prevalent.
Yeah, I see a lot of also value. I guess we call this the workflow, but it's not necessarily the analyzation of like large data at scale to derive macro level insights like how you're specialized in, right? But we think a lot about how contextual events can drive chaining of workflows that actually remove a lot of friction for the user, so that the average person can spend time on more meaningful work. And a great example of this is something called Dependbot or Dependabot. And it's essentially this open source or third-party SaaS solution that plugs into people's GitHub repos, looks for dependencies that have security vulnerabilities or need to be updated, automates a pull request. And in recent time, what we started to see is this bot that has been doing this for many years, and all of these developers getting overwhelmed with all the amount of emails, and it's like, oh great, Dependabot's out again. But now people have started automating the acceptance of those with other bots, and so suddenly you have a bot opening a pull request that accepts by another bot, and suddenly the repo no longer has a security vulnerability. And to me, that is the onset of where I hope this thing sits for a little while, because I think that's a very useful approach to automation, whether it's automation, intelligence, or AI. I would say it's the former. But I think there's really practical ways of us enhancing the human workflow by just making these systems communicate better. And it doesn't necessarily require this massive aggregation of data necessarily, but it does require very contextual signal, which often is measured out of that very large data. And that's obviously the great work you're doing.
So I'll give you an example. So I think that's a really great example of where automation and AI start to converge. And another example would be, when a content site, take your leading news publisher, is sending you a newsletter, right? If the marketer had their way, and what marketers used to do is they used to try to create segments and say, oh, this person is really interested in sports, so I want to give them a sports newsletter. This person is really interested in national news. This person's interested in stocks. So you start to create all these segments, but at some point the segments almost become like unmanageable, right? How far you can make 15 segments, 20 segments, and then all of a sudden your workload is just completely crippling you.
Yeah.
But now if you can just have one newsletter where you let the AI pick out the content recommendations that would be inserted for any given individual, you essentially get millions and millions of permutations of that newsletter, each one purpose built for that end recipient. And that's really kind of a similar example of how you can use AI and automation to create, much improved experiences, in this case for the consumer, but in your example, it was for, the developer that was involved in a tedious workflow. So
yeah. The hard thing is sometimes breaking it down into those unit pieces that can be orchestrated into the context that still makes rational sense for the personification that you're targeting.
Yeah. So you almost need another bot on the other side of the equation to say, here's what's coming in. Let me figure out what to do with all this and what actually the developer needs to handle, and what I can actually handle all by myself without any other input.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. I think the reason my example works is it's a bot doing a very specific and narrow thing that another bot can understand. Yeah. But as the context of that, or the content to the marketing and newsletter analogy, is that grows, it becomes very hard for them to share a language, and that's where ultimately you can very quickly, using automation, actually increase the mental context required from an individual. And then it's like, we're kind of going backwards here on this one. How do we thin it out, right? Low context automation, I guess, is probably one way to describe it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I like the idea of like this bot versus bot v bot, with like each with different sets of context, that then managing the workflow between two people.
Meanwhile, the person just sitting on the side drinking their coffee, watching.
Yeah.
I love
this is a good candidate for our a domain that we just bought. We just got ops.bot, and we were thinking about subdomains that would allow us to list out all the different kinds of bots for different purposes, and I think it's an interesting idea of like, how do we get machines, and this is really what that word bot means at the end of the day, but how do we get machines to talk to each other with more context, less less human interaction, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, we also have been looking into taco bots and things like that, and Neej's nickname is Neejorno, actually, because he's a great pizza chef. So maybe you might have to look into buying some domains around.
One day I'll just have a bot to make the pizza. I'll just supervise the bot. It'll be more fun for me.
We'll give you pizza.ops.bot. We'll give you the subdomain.
Oh, I love it.
There you go.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah, I love that.
Well, we're just running up on time here. Any last thoughts, Neej, that you'd like to leave the audience with?
Just great to have you guys have me on the show for you guys. I really appreciate it, and it's been a really compelling conversation. And everyone that's at home right now, I know that the last 6 months have been rough. I know people are, have gone a little stir crazy. So I'd say hang in there, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and let's make the best of 2020 into 2021.
It's a great note.
I love the positivity. Yeah. Where can we find you online, Neej?
You can find me online on, let's see, Instagram. My handle is Neej Kid. My Facebook is just Neej Gore. Gore is my last name, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on TikTok, but you won't really find me there.
I'm definitely gonna have to do some searching around that last one.
I want to see the renegades.
Yeah. Well, that's all we have time for today. Remember to click subscribe to see our weekly shows and videos, and always post your favorite post your favorite parts of the show in the comments, as well as anyone you'd like to see us bring on to the Ops Show. With that, take us out, Kyle.
All right, great show. Thanks so much, Neej. It was a good discussion.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
Always so.